Thanks everybody for joining today. This is my first social media office hours, and this is something that I really enjoy doing in my classes at Rutgers University. I teach live, but I also do some online classes, and one of the most fun things is having these late night sessions where we just kind of talk about whatever is on people's minds. So I decided, let's open it up to the world, see what happens, maybe create some great content together and talk about some of the relevant issues of the day. And I think there's no more relevant issue to anybody than this idea of social media marketing, measurement. And the question I get everywhere is, what's the ROI of this stuff, right? Well, what's the ROI of a tweet, or what's the ROI of a blog post? So what I'd like to do is spend just a few minutes talking about some of my current ideas, some of my current thinking on this, and then just open it up to whoever who is has a question around the world to come on. And as I said, I am expecting my friend Rob Peterson to join us as well. He's an expert in this area, excuse me, and teaches with me at Rutgers University on this topic. So I have a book that's well known and quite popular in the business called Social Media Explained. And I'm working on a new version of the book, and I'll be working on that over the holidays, I think. And one of the things I've been revisiting is this whole question about measurement. And one of the things I've been thinking about that I think would really help a lot of people is this idea that I think sometimes people ask the wrong question. They are not, they're saying, how do we measure ROI? Or how do we, what is the measure? And we're in this mindset, and I'm in the mindset too. I come from a big company, and what you have is a measure. So you have a measure, and then you want to compare that measure year to year to year. And I think the problem is, the question isn't what we should measure, but when. Because social media marketing is different than advertising. With advertising, you have a budget, you have a campaign, you get it approved, you have the creative, then you have some metric of what happened during that campaign. Social media marketing takes more time. It's not a cop-out. It is what it is. And we see this reflected in different research studies. There was some research done by Social Media Examiner. It's not statistically valid research, but it was a survey of 4,000 marketers. So I think there's, it's an indicator. What they showed was more than 80% of the people working on social media in the first year had an increase in awareness. They were able to see that and measure that. However, most businesses, it took 3 or 4 years before they started seeing a financial return. And I think that is a very key observation, because what happens is, through our content, through our social media engagement, we're trying to drive the amount of awareness and engagement with our connections over time. So what I want to suggest to you as the first idea today is that it's not just what we measure, but when we measure it. So in the first year, I think measures like comments, followers, are we sticking to a publishing schedule? Those are important because it shows you're creating a content creating culture. You're making it work. You're making it happen. You're learning and growing. After the first year, you should be able to move on to another set of metrics. So you change the metrics. Perfectly okay. I know for a lot of companies that's kind of mind-blowing, but I think you need to change the metrics because you're growing and maturing, and you need to measure something new. And I think in the next phase, you need to be looking at, really the theme should be connection. How are we doing on mentions? How are we doing with connecting with influencers? Are we starting to get opt-ins? Are people subscribing to us on our blog, on our video channel? So these are now signs that the content is taking hold, that people are opting in. When they opt in, they say, market to me. The next phase, you need to be looking at things like sales leads, conversions, loyalty, reduced costs in marketing. What's the time frame there? I'm not sure. The research would show 3 to 4 years before most companies start to get to that point. Can it happen sooner? Yes. Will it happen for you? It depends. The only thing I'm trying to emphasize today is this is a new way to think about measurement that I think is relevant to many businesses. I'd like to introduce my friend, Rob Peterson.
Hey, everybody.
Rob teaches with me at Rutgers. He is a consummate professional, incredibly experienced marketer. He used to be the director of strategy for Omnicom, one of the biggest advertising agencies in the world. He started his own business, Barn Raisers, up in New England, about the exact same time I started my company. So we have very similar journeys. We do similar things, but some of his specialties in the classes at the university are metrics and analytics. So I thought this would be an ideal person to come and sit with us today. So we've got some seats open. If you have some questions that you would like to ask either one of us, if you don't have a question, I'll start and talk to Rob about a few things that are on my mind. I want to take advantage of his expertise today. And I will remind people that are just joining us that I am recording this. I'll be posting it on YouTube. So if you come into the hot seat, you might end up as a piece of content. So you're welcome to join us and join the dialogue. So Rob, a question I had was I had a question last week from a student that I didn't have an immediate answer for. And the question was, if you're doing an integrated program, if you're doing advertising and content marketing and public relations, how do you tease out the value of social media in this integrated kind of program? What do you think about that? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think about it in two ways. One is I would probably try to see if there might be some equivalent metrics, between what the integrated stuff is doing and what the social stuff is doing. For example, every business should probably measure their reach, which is the collection of likes and followers that they have on all the different social networks. And that could some way be equated to impressions, which is a metric that they might be using in other media. If they're doing paid media, certainly. There is the metrics of cost per click and click-through rate. So there could be very equivalent measurements that you could sort of see, first of all, which one's performing better. And but the second probably, so that's quantitative, I guess I'd say, just metric for metric, which one does better. The one way I like to evaluate social media progress is Avinash Kaushik has a good way of thinking about business value of social media, and he calls it, and as it relates to, are you seeing business value in conversations, amplification, or applause? And an example of each is conversation would be somebody who gets out there and actually comments and engages with their audience. For example, Best Buy has a very successful customer service program called 12 Force, where they, through research, decided that customers had a need to be answered, when they were in store or had a question on social media. And also the employees wanted to help when they didn't have anything to do. So they've answered, thousands of questions and helped people. I know people who have been waiting in line for the Geek Squad and had their question answered before they got to the front of the line. So, and I saw a tweet actually from them just because they've been especially good on Twitter. And I saw a tweet just a couple of last week where they said over 3,000 employees have tweeted over 60,000 tweets helping customers. So, that would be something where you could see evidence, really, tangible evidence that has produced a result. And amplification.
Yeah, so in that piece, that's interesting. I mean, I think the key idea is really expanding the idea of value just beyond sales and ROI.
Yeah.
In that specific case, you're looking at You're solving problems in an efficient way. The other thing I like about that example, Rob, is you're using the unused time of employees in a productive way.
Yeah, it was a great program. I mean, built on research from both customers and employees, basically what they wanted.
Yeah. So I didn't mean to interrupt you. You were starting to go into the second
Well,
idea.
I mean, the best example of amplification would probably be what we all saw about a year ago with the Ice Bucket Challenge. So amplification is basically, are you seeing value because you put out content that gets shared? And probably no more successful example exists than the Ice Bucket Challenge, which generated in 1 month $100 million versus in donations versus $2.5 million the year before, the previous August, basically on media that was totally shared. And applause would be really just the value of building your social network presence over all networks through likes and followers and tweets and just watching how that goes. And so they're not mutually exclusive, by the way, either. You can probably, a good business does a little bit of all three. But if you think about your business in those buckets, you probably would see that certain areas have a greater value for you than others. And so that's just another way to think about it from a standpoint of, how do you look at, if you're running an integrated effort, how do you tease out social media? You either look for comparative metrics or you look for something that you're not getting, but could be getting from social, from the other media.
Really, really, really helpful. If you're just joining us, I see a number of people just joining. I see lots of familiar faces here. Come on and join the hot seat. We're just having open office hours here. Anybody around the world can come in and talk to us. This is a great opportunity. Rob, I consider just an amazing expert in this area. He teaches this at the graduate level at Rutgers University. And I also want to remind you that we are recording this. So one of the things I like about your answer, Rob, is that it emphasizes something that I have written a lot about and teach a lot about, and that's this idea of qualitative metrics versus quantitative metrics. And one of the little exercises that I do is I'll do a case study and talk about these connections I made through social media. And it's about maybe a 5-minute little case study. It talks about all these amazing things that happen, how I found people to help me with projects and solve problems and help me find an intern and help me. I got new content from bloggers all around the world. And at the end of the case study, I asked the class, now list all these legitimate, important business benefits. The content and the mentoring and the connection and the awareness, finding an intern. And I say, how many of these benefits could you put on an Excel spreadsheet? And the point that I'm trying to make is that a lot of the benefits of social media in general are qualitative versus quantitative. And I'm not saying don't try to measure ROI or don't appreciate quantitative measures. Most of our businesses are built on spreadsheets. They're built on by finance people and engineers. But if you don't acknowledge the powerful and legitimate qualitative benefits, you're going to be missing out. And I think this is one of the reasons why small businesses might have an advantage over big businesses in this space. Because a small business like me or you, we see these things happening. We see these connections developing. We see these business relationships developing. And if you're working in a big company, chances are there's 3 layers between you doing the work and the vice president who owns the marketing strategy and the marketing budget. And at some point, that vice president is going to say, all this tweeting you're doing is lovely, but where's my ROI? What's the ROI of this activity? Where's my pie chart? And that's when things start to fall apart. So it's not that I'm saying don't measure. I'm saying absolutely you should measure. There's no excuse not to measure. We need to be accountable. We need to measure everything that we do, but we also need to acknowledge qualitative measures, and that can be difficult. So maybe you could comment on that and your experience with qualitative versus quantitative as as a measurement technique in this space?
Well, I think every business on the measurement side of social media should get into before jumping into it. You should sort of agree on maybe a half a dozen metrics that you are going to measure. I think some of the most important ones would be some type of reach, which somebody could do on an Excel spreadsheet, just adding up all their followers and likes and everybody else, which you'd measure on a regular basis. Some type of engagement, which you might need to use some type of software or something else to measure the collection of likes and shares and comments. There's a very interesting case I saw on a website that does this called Simply Measured, and they did a little analysis of engagement in the cruise ship area, and the ones that had the biggest likes were Princess and Disney, and just basically Behemoth, the monolith the big cruise companies. But Norwegian lines actually beat them both in terms of engagement, and just really you could see how they had a much greater progress of sharing and liking and people commenting on their content. Now, if you were trying to get to some type of measurement of that, I mean, that's a big industry. You could easily see if you directed them to landing pages on your website, or if you're measuring traffic sources in your Google Analytics, or you were getting people to book a cruise, you could easily see if that level of time and investment in content that you were putting out was having some type of measure. These were qualitative, I guess, posts that kind of just interested people, but did it really generate any kind of impact? And it wouldn't be hard to set up a little tracking of my engagements going. Are they going to places that I could just work out on the website where only people from the Facebook page would go? Are they taking actions that I can make sure it came from that? So these are, this is an example of how kind of qualitative information can be put into quantitative and measured.
I know a lot of people are very critical of those measures because they're fluffy. Mentions. Well, I've got more mentions than the Disney Cruise Line. Well, who cares? How does that show up on the bottom line? And a really interesting insight that I had was I had a conversation with Jonathan Mindenhall. He was the Senior Vice President of Creative Strategy for Coca-Cola. Now I believe he's the CMO for Uber. Last I saw anyway. He's a popular guy. I don't know where he is now. I think he's the CMO for Uber. And one of the comments that he made to me was, he said, this is when he was at Coca-Cola. He said, we want to own a disproportionate share of the popular culture conversation. And I thought that was an extremely interesting metric. And I challenge my students and my clients to think about, what would it take for you to have a disproportionate share of the conversation in your industry, whether it's insurance in central New Jersey, or whether it's car repair in Georgia. So this is something, like you said, there are low-cost tools out there today that we can see this and we can track this. And the other thing that's interesting about this, Rob, is that I'm not allowed to talk about the details of this study, but there was a very, very large company that I was working for that did a multi-year analysis that showed a statistical correlation between share of conversation and market share over multiple products, multiple companies over time. I think it just makes sense. If you have a bigger share of the conversation, wouldn't that be a great leading indicator to sales? And the other thing I like about this idea as a metric, and that it's not fluffy, is that I think it drives the right behavior in our companies. What does it take to have a disproportionate share of the conversation in our business? Number one, we've got to have great content. We've got to have great content that's conversational, that people want to share. Number two, we've got to know who are those key people in the conversations, sharing the content. Do we know who those people are? Third, we need to engage with them. So those are the things we need to do to drive a disproportionate share of the conversation. And I think that's a wonderful strategy for a marketing department. So yeah. I like that metric because it drives the right behavior.
Yeah, I would add a couple of other things just in the, to consider. But
that was a perfectly good answer.
But another thing to just layer on top of that, let's just say to build on it, is really if you want to own a disproportionate share, it also would be good to see what your competitors, how often they're doing what they're doing, so that you can sort of, that's the whole area. If you're going to beat them, you have to obviously be doing either learning from them, which is really what you're doing, to see what they do that works, and then making sure that you're doing it more often than not. One other metric I'll throw out there to manage the conversation, and there are tools that are getting out there that people can use, basically open source, to do this, is, and I'll give an example, is a sentiment analysis. A sentiment analysis monitors basically by social network. It's computer generated, and it's taking just the positive and negative mentions and ascribing, which networks have more or less positive feedback or not. Now, that's that was actually used by, when I mentioned before, the Ice Bucket Challenge last year. Just that whole effort was basically out of the control of the ALS Association. Was totally crowdsourced and computer generated, and so they looked at sentiment analysis daily. And one of the things that they found was that the sentiment was generally positive on all social networks except for Twitter, where it was equal, positive and negative. And so when they dug into the text, because you'd use a sentiment analysis as kind of a direction, so if it's because it is machine generated. So what did they, what was happening here? And when you looked at the text, what they found was that there was more comments on Twitter than any of the other social networks about the funds being misappropriated. And so what they did, because everything went from social to their website where you made the donations, was that they were, vehement about every day publishing a press release that acknowledged what was going on in social media. And so they credit a lot of the success of their effort to just really watching sentiment and daily updating, because it really was just a 30-day period where they generated a huge amount of money, that guided them in terms of really managing the conversation effectively.
That's a very interesting insight, Rob. Again, it presents a hard edge to something fluffy like sentiment. Right. You're able to roll sentiment into momentum. I like that very much. One of the case studies I use in my class is the sentiment analysis project that I did for Listerine. Now, the reason I like using that case study is because Listerine that's about as boring as you can get, right? And so I give examples like this in my classes because I figure if you can create momentum around Listerine, you can create momentum around just about anything. And believe it or not, there are passionate conversations out there around oral care.
I believe you.
Who are these crazy people? I don't know, but they're out there. So, and what we could see was that there wasn't a lot of overlap between Listerine and these conversations around oral care. So they did not have a disproportionate share of the conversation. And the other thing that we saw is that these conversations of Listerine would spike up. All of a sudden, the volume would be low, the sentiment would be low, and they'd spike up. And all of a sudden, there's like good things happening around the conversations of Listerine. If you're not in tune with that as a company and as a brand manager, you're going to miss this opportunity to find out why. What's going on? How do we keep it going? How do we make this into momentum? Is there something going on out there that we can capitalize on?
Yeah, and that gets into the whole other area, which is critical to this conversation is listening, and taking advantage of that. So there is got to be some kind of area, whether it's a text analysis or text or sentiment analysis, or just basically on a qualitative area, just listening to what consumers saying, it kind of guides your program. You know, it's possible, and we've done this in a couple cases these days with just the information that's out there, to actually do focus groups through social listening more effectively than you would do in the traditional sense. You know, larger sample, if you're smart about the keywords and the competitors you're looking at, you could almost in real time see what people are saying across a larger sample size without having to go across the country and pay moderators and take people out of the office. So there's really been there's a great area of just how social can do listening metrics, either on a,
well,
on
we've
a
been
small scale
joined
or large.
by my friend Jen. Jen
Hello.
has been a wonderful supporter and reader for a long time. She has a very interesting question, Rob, about developments in Facebook and measurement. So Jen, take it away.
So, I mean, you guys probably know Facebook obviously has restricted their API to developers. They've partnered with DataSift, and there's vendors that are working with DataSift to give you some, viewpoint into the data, but we don't have access to conversation. And I can't remember the statistic, but I think it's like 80% of people are on Facebook. So I feel like when we're doing audits for brands, we're losing potentially the majority of the conversations to really measure sentiment and brand mentions and the problems consumers might have. Is there any way to work around this, or is this just something we're going to have to tell clients and other folks, hey, there's restrictions and there's just nothing we can do?
Well, maybe and just if I'm not understanding the question, just correct me. But a lot of the tools that are out there, Radian 6, for example, would be tools that could measure conversations that are going on Facebook. They have a pretty good area there. So I think with any type of research, it's digital or social, should start with keywords and really just what are the important ones to get, and just looking at them for both your industry and maybe your categories. But I think that option still is there. My guess is that Facebook, and I'm sure that we all probably have opinions about this, it's in business to make money from advertising, and so I think it was what was the stat that at any given time the average person can see 15,000 posts? So Facebook has to have control over what they see and to manage the content stream better. So my guess as time goes by, the paid metrics for Facebook are going to become more sophisticated and available to advertisers, just like AdWords is to Google users. So I hope that provides. Well, I mean,
as a follow-up, we have
Radian
6, and Radian 6 can only track at this point. Maybe they've had an update, but they could only track mentions from pages that were obviously public-facing, and they could not track the private conversation. And I've been working with Nuvi, and they also have a Facebook offering, and you can track kind of a gut feeling, like there have been 100,000 mentions of a brand, and it's from predominantly men who are predominantly this age. But we can't get into that individual conversation. So to your point, it would be awesome from my perspective if Facebook said to advertisers, hey, pay, we'll give you keyword access. But meanwhile, I guess it's just a pain point that I have, and, I'm looking for a way.
I think it's a great question, Jen. And the thing I like about your question is that it's not just a Facebook issue. This is where the world is going, because look at some of the announcements or some of the indicators that Twitter's throwing out there, and how they're bringing in their API again. They cut it off to a lot of developers. I think it was the summer of, was it last year, maybe 2013. And the issue is that whoever controls the data is in charge.
Yeah. And
that's where a lot of the value is coming from, especially with something like Twitter, and especially this enormous opportunity with the data and the conversations on Facebook. So I think you're bringing up a really, really good point, that a lot of this is where the trends are going. A lot of this data that we've been living with and loving as marketers, it's going to be going away.
Yep.
And the only way we're going to have access to that is it's going to be paying for it. Even something like Twitter talked about this idea of getting rid of the number on the Twitter button.
I saw that.
Yeah, there's a bubble of people in social media that's going to be really upset about that. The general world, I don't really know.
Yeah.
But the fact of the matter is, there are a lot of companies that depend on that number.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot, you look at influence marketing. You look at all these little boutique agencies that have popped up. They need that number. And so now they're going to have to pay Facebook for it. A lot of people are crying out about it. But to be honest with you, if I'm the CMO of Twitter, I'd probably do the same thing.
That's business, and they're a public-facing company.
Business.
Yeah, that's business.
And we've been living in this free world for a long time. And just like we always have, we're going to have to find ways to adapt and adopt and adjust. So I think it's a wonderful question that you're asking, and maybe even in some ways kind of the tip of the iceberg.
Cool. Thank you for answering my question. I appreciate it, for having me on.
Okay. Thanks so much, Jen.
Well,
we're getting kind of toward the end of our time here already, Rob. It's been a lot of fun. And let me just ask you, whenever you're thinking and writing these days, and by the way, we have time for probably one more question if someone wants to jump on. Rob, what are some of the big ideas that you've been thinking about, writing about in your classes today? Are there a couple key points or ideas that you can share with the audience today?
Well, I think that every business has to kind of, as important as metrics are, you've got to fit them into a schedule that you can manage and look at them on a regular basis and take action on them. So I think every business is different. So I always encourage people to not try to boil the ocean with measurement and analytics, but find those 5 or 6 metrics that can really be associated with some type of business value, and we call them the key performance indicators. And really make a commitment to looking at those with a team across a team that really makes decisions and makes actions on some type of regular schedule, whether it's weekly, monthly, even quarterly, as long as what comes out of it is actionable results. So that I'm seeing, and I'm kind of seeing certainly social, probably on the area of big data, probably has the most impact of almost any channel, because there's just so much of that's mentioned in terms of, or modified. Movie companies now have better algorithms from just opening weekend receipts, because they can look at so much social data that comes in about reviews and everything else, and customer service people can script their stuff for call centers because they know what people are most likely to call and ask or complain about. So social is really, of any of these, probably one of the best tools for helping people use the data in a way that
awesome.
Can manage it better.
Yeah, Brian, take it away. Where you calling in from today, Brian?
Montreal.
Montreal, one of my favorite cities. Brian McFarland, what's on your mind today?
Yeah, so my question it relates to social ROI and also about accountability with your clients. I mean, I have a few social media clients, and I manage their social media. And the biggest challenge I face is sort of that hump of getting them from month 3 to month 6 to month 12, and proving, taking the social metrics that we have and proving your worth and how that value is being, how it's being distilled into their company. So how do you help your clients get over that hump? I mean,
let me try a quick answer, and then I'll turn it over to you, Rob. When we started the program today, I talked about the not just what we measure, but when we measure it. And that's a cultural mindset, I think, that we have to get our customers over. It's not that we change the language. We need to use the language of business. But we need to also tell them, just look at the data and look at the research, that this is not like advertising. A better analogy is to compare this to personal networking. If you go to a trade show, you might meet a few people. You might hand out a few business cards. Then a few months later, you go to another show. You reconnect with those people again. Maybe you have a deeper conversation. Maybe after a year, they recognize you. So, oh yeah, remember you from Chicago. Yeah, you've been on my mind. You work on this, don't you? Yes. it may take months or a year to develop those relationships that are actionable. On social media, we make these connections. They're weak relational links. They're not necessarily actionable. It takes time. It's not easy for a lot of businesses to hear. So
it's a marathon, not a sprint.
It's a marathon.
I think the problem that we have is a very similar one that we had in SEO, is that we spend a great deal of our time educating our clients on their perception of social media, especially the ones that have been jaded by it and had bad experiences with it. I try to use return on engagement as my proof of concept as opposed to return on investment, because the other issue here is that people are investing in their businesses and they want to use social media to build awareness of their brand and get engagement and get people excited about what they do. And I think that's the biggest takeaway that I try to convince clients on. But fuzzy vanity metrics just don't fly anymore. And this is a tougher sell when you're moving up the social ladder with clients, when you're starting to move into the Fortune 5000s and up.
I think part of the key, and I'll turn it over to Rob because I'm sure he's got some insight on this. Part of the key is we have to level set expectations. This is not like advertising. You can spend money on an ad and take out an ad, and then you can offer a coupon and you can get an immediate response. That's not how social media works. So it is a longer time frame. We need to change the mindset, change the expectations, and also introduce this idea of qualitative measures as well as quantitative. I don't think we should be afraid of ROI. I think we just need to change be realistic about what's achievable and when. So Rob, what observations do you have to help Brian with his question?
Well, I would say, Brian, that first of all, the analogy to SEO was a good one, which also kind of takes time and staying at it. But I think in a simple way that there should always be an opportunity, especially since you mentioned that hump period, of showing what is the added value that social media is bringing. If it's a small business or a B2B business that relies on salespeople, how is it increasing quality leads, in a way that you could measure? If it's a business where you're involved in trade shows or PR releases, how is it adding value, additional mentions, impressions, et cetera, to what's happening there? And so really, if you're in it day in and day out, it's pretty easy to sort of see what's happening if you know what are the periods, if your objective is lead generation, how many people might have been first touched through a social network, if your objective is providing an additional outreach, basically what happened around key events, because the event could be as important for what generated it as could be the mentions there. So I think there's always kind of a steady one to the area of it's providing some level of added value that could justify it, and then really just tying it into there probably along the way have to be accountable metrics of sales or conversions. Every measure, even social, should have really, we didn't touch on this yet, we should always have conversions as a key metric. It's the only way you're going to get to ROI and maybe even ways there. So to end this kind of on Mark's point is, digital and social takes longer to build and to reach people than traditional sources, but the value is that it provides a better insight into what their actual behavior is and a better way to build a direct relationship.
Yeah, it does. So, thank you very much, guys.
I hope that answers your question.
The thing I love about your answer there, Rob, is that again, don't be afraid of the language of business. If the business appreciates conversions and ROI, we have to go there too. We can't fluff it up.
Exactly.
With these new metrics that we're making up. We've got to talk the language of the business. There's just somebody the other day was saying it's our job to change the language of business, and I don't see it that way. I think the language of business is the language of business. I think if you worked in business 100 years ago, they're going to be talking about sales and conversions and ROI. If you're in business 100 years from now, they're going to be talking about sales, conversions, and ROI. So,
Right.
you know, that we can't insert our new language into this, but we do certainly have, you know, an education component. My dear friend, Jacob Curtis is on the line here from Portland, Oregon. Hey, buddy, what
Hello.
question do you have today?
So I'm so glad you have these office hours and that I don't have to go to another conference just to see you again. But it'll happen again. So my question is, when bringing on new clients or when dealing with, say, prospective clients and business owners that you're trying to pitch and sell social media services to, what, from your experience, Rob, as well, is a good time period to say, well, I'm not going to report after the first 6 months, or I'm not going to provide you monthly reporting after we first start, because ultimately we don't really have anything to report. And as you're saying, a lot of these things take time to build. So, and then a lot of the time there's a lot of other cracks in the businesses, such as a non-converting website or other little minor things within their whole marketing funnels that aren't working. So when you do start to do social and they're looking for these immediate results or some sort of data that you can report on, I find myself in the first few months sending over screenshots of conversations I've had with their fan base as a community manager, where I'm like, look at this person who mentioned us or didn't even mention us and was talking about your product. I found out that conversation through social listening, engaged with them as a community manager, and soft closed them into where now they're vocally saying, oh, well, I'm going to go check this out on your website and maybe order it. And then they send a picture of it, you know what, when it gets delivered.
I mean, I think there's a broad question there, but there's a little thing I want to point out here. I think this idea of sending that screenshot like that, that's brilliant, because that's one of those qualitative measures that smart managers will appreciate, smart leaders will appreciate. It's a story. So I was doing this influence work for this big tech company, and one of the stories I did for this tech company I saw was retweeted by one of their competitors. It's crazy. It's like their competitors are promoting this thing that I wrote for them. So I took a screenshot of the tweet. That had a powerful impact. How do you put that on a spreadsheet? You can't. So, but Rob, why don't you talk a little bit about Jacob's question about the timing of this, and you know, what's the rhythm and the flow of reporting some of these things?
And should you maybe not offer reporting for the first 6 months or so?
Yeah.
No, I definitely wouldn't do that. I'd probably almost do the inverse and then maybe kind of schedule it out. I mean, I think at the beginning you just kind of have to gauge your audience, you know, and where they are on the learning curve. So, you know, if it was I would probably make the investment in educating them during the early part of this, because it would help you out, or me. It helps me out just to know kind of where they are and how much they, you know, need to understand. As we've been saying all through this, how much of the nomenclature is really new and needs to be defined and things like that. So I tend to sort of be a little heavier touch at the beginning, just to make sure that I'm bringing them along. You know, at some point, whatever the data periods are, I think the hard thing is to just say, are we going to be taking, if we met bi-weekly, you know, and looked at these numbers, would we be making actions from them? You know, and if the answer is no, then maybe it should be monthly or every other month or even quarterly. I think the idea then is to get to a schedule from the standpoint of, okay, now we're all clear on what's important, and you know, we've all gotten educated on this, and we know how to compare it maybe to other metrics. So now what sort of rhythm do we put it into so that when we meet, you know, we know that there's a next step out of this, that's these 5 actions are going to happen. And if the action even is we take what our recommendations are up to the C-suite, you know, then that's an action too. But ultimately, actionability on the metrics.
Cool. Thanks, guys.
I agree with Rob, Jacob, that you got to look at a lot of these programs that we use. Self-populate the reports in a very useful and colorful visual way anyway. So it normally might not take a lot of extra effort to do the reports, but I think Rob makes a great point that by reporting regularly, especially up front, it's a teachable moment as well, to say, this is what's happening, this is what's going on, here's something to be excited about. it also gives you an opportunity to build in quick wins. I think this is really important, as especially people just doing this for the first time. You need to build in milestones that are easily achievable to make it positive. So the internal conversation is positive about these measurements and these metrics, and you're creating some excitement. So I would definitely look at monthly reporting, as Rob said, maybe even more often than that up front, and view it not as something that's a burden, but something that's a teachable moment and something that drives that culture. You have to remember, culture is the number one predictor of success on these things. It's going to be the number one predictor of your success. Even as an outsider, that company culture, if they don't understand what you're doing and they don't support what you're doing, you're going to be dropped eventually. So I love Rob's point about using this as really as a teachable moment.
And you can really set yourself up too by maybe in the initial audit of the business social, you can start seeing these conversations that, hey, here's a whole forum of people that are talking about you that you're not replying to. Here's a 6-week-old conversation, yada, yada. And so then you're almost setting that precedence of, hey, here is the value I'm providing in this report because you weren't there in those conversations before I got hired on. So you're kind of setting up your success and building that value even in the pitching or auditing process. Another thing I just want to recommend before I jump out is I picked this up from Brian Fonzo too, but one thing that he does is he creates an awesomeness folder for every client he has. And essentially what he does is he uses that folder to capture screenshots and just store them in there. So this is when you get that thing from your boss and he's like, well, what did we do this week? And it's just like, well, I actually have a folder full of just little tidbits that I was just keeping, maybe not even to show you, but since you asked, here you go. And so he actually has an awesomeness folder, and I thought that was pretty great for community managers or
yeah, that's the whole idea, Rob, these qualitative benefits. And you know what? We need to embrace that. It's not something to be it's not something that's necessarily fluffy. Smart businesses, smart leaders, they're going to recognize that value, that sometimes the value is in stories, and that's perfectly okay. Well, we've run a little bit over time today, but I think we really got into some meaty discussions. I hope it's been helpful to everyone, and thank you so much. I will be posting this on YouTube and probably on my blog as well. Rob, thank you so much for joining us today. This was fun, so much fun, and thanks everyone.